everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. I see so many friendly faces. This is very fireside chat. I should be talking about the state of the nation. But nobody really wants to be doing that, unless you all want to leave weeping. I have been asked to read for 5 to 8 minutes of my new book. It's called A Little More Human. So I'm going to do that. I will say that the book is kind of structured as a, I think the musical term for this is a rondo, but Mom, is this a rondo? If you do A, B, C, A, is that a rondo? It's a kind of rondo? It's not a round, though. It's a rondo? There must be some musical term for this, right? Something? A, B, C, A? Okay, never mind. So you've got 3 characters, and the way the book is structured is it follows character A, B, C, and then returns to A. And I did this mostly because I thought the book was a little bit nuts and a little nutty in terms of its plotting, and I wanted to find a way to anchor it. So what I'm going to do for you guys is I'm going to read you a mini novel. I'm going to just read you kind of some of the first opening sentences from a whole bunch of sections, just to give you a sense of what you might be in for if you decide to read the novel. He came to on the back of a horse. Ada came to on a rascal 318 power chair, one calf draped over the armrest, back stuck to the leather. It was hot and she was naked, almost naked, which was no consolation when a sock was the only coverage you had left. She checked her body. There was mascara rained down her face and a bruise flowered on the inseam of her thigh. It came to in reds and greens, the mid-fusiform gyrus, the inferior occipital gyrus, Doc's head sequestered in the MRI tube, immobilized in a plastic cage padded with memory foam. He wore prism glasses and earplugs, hospital-issue socks with the tacky chevron strips on the bottom, a cotton robe. He'd yet to brush his teeth. His coffee had gone cold. This was his home plus trailer annex in which sat a 10 million custom-built, first-of-its-kind 7 Tesla MRI scanner. He'd put it on autopilot. A T1 weighted head scan, 64 slices of his brain, sagittal view, 4 minutes. A T2 weighted sequence as he looked at pictures of his wife from 2008, the year she died. Sarah in a bathing suit at Malopata Beach, their last vacation together. Sarah in tennis dress, returning serve, the clay dusted up her legs. Sarah on election night, hands in the air, clapping. 30 seconds of functional imaging, then nothing. The mind at rest. Later, he'd look at the scans, at the colors blip through his brain, depicting activity, and think, Sarah, my beloved, this is where you live. I'm being racy up here. A photo spread, 4 pictures in all. A woman in the woods who was naked. A woman whose face Phil could not see. Her body limp, legs apart, a puckered gash at the knee. One nipple dipped in grit. What looked like blood drizzled across her stomach. Phil stared at the photos. In one, his boot, his, as if he were standing over the body. In another, him on his knees in his Dodger blue unitard, peeled down to the waist, palming the woman's neck. The look on his face hard to explain. Anguished, excited, deranged. 6 a.m., light scaling the horizon, pastels swatching the sky. The miracle of the universe, and Doc with printouts in his lap. Every morning of Phil's life for the past 2 years, coffee, toast, tweeze. He wasn't vain about his dress, and there wasn't much he could do about the architecture of his face. But he could tend to the rest, so he tweezed his unibrow and shaved his head and greeted these rituals with pleasure. I care about myself. Or frustration. My life is so boring, depending on his mood. But this past week, he'd left off his habits, so his hairline, already receded halfway up his head, had turned black, and the wedge between his brows was tarantula. The papers said they were doing forensic facial reconstruction on the swimmer. Doc was not a religious man, but he did believe in comeuppance. Phil ran through what he'd heard it was like, an induced state of calm, like when you and your girl are listing everything you love about each other, and for how absorbing is this dialogue, the world falls away. Like when you're in the anti-gravity chamber and feel Edenic, serene, antediluvian. How bad could that be? Not so bad if that's what hypnosis really was. But probably it wasn't. Phil had seen The Manchurian Candidate and believed in its premise. And in college, he'd even seen people hypnotized live, the results being that friends who were unlikely to raise their heads in the hallway for dread of being noticed were disrobing for an audience of 300, thanks to some Svengali and his trigger words, green, burger, Kmart. Phil was waiting, eyes locked on the front door of Ada's apartment complex. Every time the door opened, his heart lunged halfway down the street before being recalled to the starting block. How many times could it keep lunging like that? You know how 3 years of law school don't teach you shit about how to practice law, and how 1 year teaches you even less? This had been obvious to Ada even before enrolling. Less obvious, but more difficult to accept, was that the accumulated experiences of her life, whose lessons were more philosophical than practical, could not teach her what to do when you recognized a dead guy on TV and wanted to claim the $150,000 reward for information leading to an arrest in the case, but knew you needed more info if you wanted to collect. You thought your boss was involved, or knew something, judging from the ferocity with which he'd snatched that brochure from your hand, when you yourself were into some illegal activity that suggested caution if dealing with the police, when your parents were into some illegal activity that suggested caution when dealing with the police, when, while everyone else had been watching crime shows on TV that might have weaponized your thinking with common sense, you were taking walks and picking daisies. Who could Ada ask for advice? No one. She was on her own. Another day off work with options that were less escapist than depressing. Some people wanted nothing more than to abdicate the throne of self-care, to eat applesauce all day, to watch TV and make their vitals someone else's problem. But Doc wanted none of it. Phil woke up alive. This in itself seemed momentous, and so he paused there before starting a more general systems check. He said hello, and found that his throat was sore and his mouth was dry, but that the word he'd meant to say had been hello, and that this was the word he'd actually said. Speech, check. Why this was first on his list and not movement or cognitive awareness of self, he didn't know. He told his arms and legs to move, and they did. He opened his eyes, and though they felt dipped in butter, he could see. It was dawn, which didn't mean much to Phil now that he did not have to sleep. Whatever energy might have been conserved for him during sleep was supplied by the drug. Dun dun. Ada had never seen a dead body before, and to the extent that she thought about it, she'd imagined the dead looked like they are sleeping, which turned out to be not true at all. Sun cresting over the mountains, the trees shellacked in amber, a lake, a sky, and anyone in between, there on Earth only to prove that nature is boss. All right, I'm going to stop with that.
Anyways, it's totally my pleasure to be here talking with you. I've been a fan of Fiona's work forever and ever and ever, and a fan of Fiona also, and I'm super duper a fan of Fiona's haircut. I don't know if you guys knew Fiona before her hair got short, but I felt it was reason for her to regret many decades of her life previous to getting her haircut. I don't know. I like changes in one's life that make one, have a lot of
This is the caliber of
regrets.
Conversation you can expect.
Exactly. We were going to invite everybody down to lie on the couches with us downstairs. So anyways, I did drink a coffee before we came here to try to get past hair, so here we go. I'm gonna try. Okay, so will you please, I was trying to remember the quote from the LA Times book review, Philip K. Dick, telenovela, Pension. What was the actual, can you give me the whole?
It was something like, Heidi's referring to this review I got in the LA Times.
Yes.
It was something like, I don't know, imagine Philip K. Dick writes a situation comedy meets
Yes.
a telenovela written by Thomas Pynchon.
Yes.
That's a salad right there.
Yes. So
got
that
all the
being, I think, a
ingredients.
fairly accurate description, and we were trying to decide if this was like a positive or like it's hard to tell if that was like
I feel like we should take a vote.
we should no. But then we were like, the context is it's coming from Los Angeles, so I feel like knowing that where it came from, you're like, that is such a compliment. Anyway, so that being the case, right? I feel like I read books and it's a game that's fun to play where you're like, what was the original, like what was the seed of this book, right? Like what was the original energy that kind of like got you writing this novel? And this novel is so, I don't want to say complicated, but it's like there's a lot going on in the best possible way. So talk me through like what was the sort of original energy that got you started?
I want to have like a good story.
I know.
I'm
you don't even
working
have
on
to.
it, but
well, how about this?
I'm going to give it to you though.
No. I actually, more interesting, I want you to answer this question never the same way. And today you answer it this whatever way, and then next time different, next time different.
Well, then I'll just tell you the truth of the matter, which is that many years ago I had overheard someone say, actually, quote, "I woke up this morning on the back of a horse." And I just thought, well, that's just the weirdest thing I've ever heard. And the context in which I heard it made sense. However, he had woke up and like out of a blackout on a horse in Prospect Park. And I just thought, who does that happen to? It's just, I don't know. So I kind of filed that away. The book, I guess.
And how long ago was this?
You don't want to know. It's like 2007 or something. So
it's all right. It takes a long time for a novel to collect around that sentence, you know?
It's true. I have a kind of like one of these horrible stomach conditions, and so to try to master the stomach condition, I thought I would take myself to hypnosis. And I went and I started to see this hypnotist who was also a therapist, and so in order to prepare myself to be amenable to hypnosis, we kind of had to do some therapy, so I did that with her, and she would ask me these questions like, well, what do you want? And I just sort of panic and go, I don't know, what are you talking about? Just hypnotize me, make my stomach better. Anyway, it turned out I could never be hypnotized because I was absolutely terrorized by the prospect of what this woman would do if she just sort of bore into my brain and left something in there. The point being that I was completely rattled by this experience because
you failed?
Well, because
to be hypnotized?
One, I could not be helped, apparently, which is a horrible thing to have any like therapist tell you cannot be helped.
By hypnosis, though.
Yeah.
You got to finish that sentence. You cannot be helped by hypnosis.
I was prepared to dilate the sentiment to mean I cannot be helped at all.
Right, of course.
But also the idea that, my mind was completely impenetrable to not just her, but to me, because she just kept asking these pointed questions. So I filed that away. And I was very shaken by this prospect. And then, this was, maybe 2009 or something, so a few years later, and then I stumbled upon this book called Mapping the Mind by Rita Carter. It had what looked like the London subway subway map, the tube on the cover, and I thought, oh, this is cool. So I opened it. I actually am very squeamish about this stuff, meditation makes me very squeamish, this whole idea of thinking about your breath and your body and your lungs, and I just freak out. So this is not the kind of book I ever want to open, but I opened it because I like the London Tube, apparently. And I kind of fell upon this experiment with this split brain patient who, he had his lobes had been split apart, and so they were doing these experiments on him, and they managed to find a way to communicate with each half of his head. And basically the way they did this was they would ask...
Did they put a plate in? Did they do that thing where they put the plate in between the lobes?
No, they were already separated.
Oh,
so
okay.
It's just how it was.
Wasn't one of those plate things.
No plate thing.
You know about that, right?
I do.
They tried and you failed at that too.
So here's what they do.
Yeah.
Here's what they do. They manage to provide all the information to only one side of the brain. They do this by, for instance, asking a question like, do you like your, and then they will write down mother, the word mother, and hide one eye, so that only the right side of the brain has access to all the information required to answer the question. So they asked this guy, like, what do you want to be? And one half of his head said, I can't remember, like draftsman or something, or stenographer, something kind of, not so exciting. But then the other half said automobile racer. And I read this and had just a kind of like a little nervous breakdown right there in the bookstore, because what does this, what does this mean?
Yeah.
How is it that each half of his head had completely different ideas about what he wanted his life to be, and the only way one half, which had been gagged by evolution, had been able to express itself is because they chopped his head in half. Terrorizing. filed it away.
Yes.
And then then I was at MacDowell, which was the artist colony in New Hampshire, and I was like, okay, I'm going to start my new novel here at MacDowell. And one thing about these artist residencies, which is alternately wonderful and just horrible, is that even though you're in the middle of the woods in your own little cabin, it's like you can hear everybody else typing, tick, 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 tick. Like that's not the sound of nature. That's the sound of art being made all around you, except for you, who is doing nothing. So I remember just sitting there being like, okay, I have no ideas. I've got nothing. And then, out came, I was like, okay, he came to on the back of a horse. And of course, you write a sentence like that and you immediately feel compelled to answer the obvious question begged by a sentence like that, which is like, why? What's he doing there? And so I just sort of began to move along with this one character. I knew I was kind of interested. I had certain thematic preoccupations, this idea of the insoluble self, being impenetrable, to not being able to know, yourself at all. And I thought, well, what's the vehicle for kind of exploring these ideas? And there we went. That was a long answer.
No, it's a great answer.
It's my story for
But
today.
I mean, so is that typical for you then? Because I always think about that. Like, it's so amazing when you stumble upon something where it's like, for you, it was just that sentence, right? It's just like you're always looking for like these apertures, or maybe aperture is the wrong word. Maybe it's just like some kind of magnet that where like all the filings from your brain can like attach to it and it makes sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've written 3 novels, so I don't think that's a huge body of work from which to be able to say, well, this is how I operate. But there's also so many years in between novels that you change.
Yeah.
Your process changes, your thinking changes. I would say that in general, I tend to have my ideas before I have the story that goes with it, which is always kind of a risk because, you don't want your work to seem polemical or pedantic. And, your characters are just these like straw men around whom you want to, or on whom, forget straw men, just, you don't want these people to seem like vehicles for like your grand ideas about humanity. So I'm always looking for ways, to marry up, character and story and what have you. This novel just sort of happened that way. The last book I knew very clearly, like I wanted to write like a big book about loneliness.
Right.
But it turns out all my books are about loneliness.
Yes.
Which is a little distressing. I'm wondering, I mean, we're going to open it up for Q&A afterwards and it'll be, I know a lot of you here, so probably this won't happen, but last time I went on tour, like almost everywhere I went, someone was like, are you lonely?
Right.
So, yeah. But it turns out that this is what I seem to be kind of obsessed with, and I can't believe that somehow I ended up writing this kind of novel, again.
Again.
Yeah.
But not. I mean, I don't know.
It's
I feel like
different, but it's
I
not.
recently was watching that Hitchcock Truffaut documentary that where they were talking about like Hitchcock being somebody who was just like, I'm obsessed and I'm just going to follow my obsessions. And there was something really freeing about that because I think there's a lot of guilt around following one's obsessions or like realizing that one's obsessions are somewhat repetitive in a way. I don't know. There was something really kind of liberating about feeling like, oh, it's okay to do that. You could be Hitchcock. I
have no guilt. I just have maybe some sort of keen sense of, disappointment. Like, oh, here we are again in this territory.
No, totally.
But
not. But different. I mean, always different.
It's different, and it's kind of it's an inexhaustible subject as far as I'm concerned.
It's pretty inexhaustible.
And this book was different. My first 2 books, I really was thinking about knowledge of other people as a kind of threshold for intimacy. And in this book, I was much more concerned with sort of knowledge of self being a real impediment to kind of intimacy with other people. Even you can't even know like anything about what's transpiring in your inner life. How is it that you're supposed to surmount, just kind of natural barriers to intimacy with other people? So it's kind of a different take on the same subject. I feel like my next book should be about, I don't know, like feet.
Yeah, 1 foot. Just one.
It's very funny. Let that sink in. That's very funny.
Okay, so clearly all my questions tonight are going to be about documentaries because it's April, and I feel like in times of stress, I just stream documentaries. So recently, I was streaming all of those J.T. Leroy documentaries. Has everyone done this already? And if you haven't, like, you should maybe leave right now and go do this.
No, but tell them who J.T. Leroy is.
You guys know who Does anyone not know who J.T. Leroy
Don't do
is?
that.
No, it's fine. I just want to know. Okay, really quick. Maybe you're better than I am at summary. Okay, essentially, J.T. Leroy is a very famous writer who turned out to be a total fabrication of another person. So that's not a very good way to, that doesn't make it sound interesting at all. J.T. Leroy wrote a bunch of novels, got really, really famous, but was always very scared of being in the limelight, and then suddenly became so famous that had to come out of the limelights, had to come out into the world. And so a person came out who was supposedly J.T. Leroy. And anyways, it turns out that it was an actor playing J.T. Leroy. J.T. Leroy doesn't exist. He is not actually a very young, HIV positive, former truck stop prostitute. He is or was a 30-something-year-old woman from Brooklyn. Okay, anyways, done with that. My question is that this 30-year-old woman from Brooklyn, Laura, I was just thinking a lot about writers talking about how the power dynamics between them and their characters. And so I recently came upon two very different approaches to this power dynamic or beliefs about this power dynamic. One being Laura Alberts, who is J.T. Leroy. She sort of speaks about J.T. Leroy almost like her characters are like people inside, or like there's a writer inside of her who is a character who then writes their life, right? So she sort of speaks about herself as somebody almost who has multiple personalities, right? And maybe
not surprising.
Truly does. And then I recently was interviewing Rachel Cusk, and she was talking about how she was sort of issuing a warning against people who say something that I guess as a writer you hear somewhat frequently, which is like, the character just like took me over. Like the character just, like I just obeyed the character, and she was just like, people should be very careful, especially women, talking about being taken over by a character. Anyways, so I'm just curious, there's like a political and also like a power dynamic in a strange way between writers and characters, or these people would seem to suggest as much. And I was wondering if are you like friends with your characters? What's your relationship with that?
My fear is that they're all me. Which is sort of a horrible idea because none of them is particularly exceptional in any way. But no, I feel sort of intimate, comfortable with them. I don't feel taken over by them. I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
I never felt like I'm just sort of some vessel for the muse or that all sounds like gobbledygook to me. I really.
That's a gobbledygooky thing you hear a lot.
Yeah,
though,
I know.
Don't you?
I've never understood that particularly. I write characters that are fallible and full of pathos, and they're struggling to surmount their worser selves, and I recognize all of that, as stuff that I recognize, not just that stuff in me, but I recognize that in I recognize in all of you. Yeah. But I feel close to them.
Yeah.
My concern is that I always am writing the same character over and over again because I'm constantly sort of relentlessly attracted to that sort of personality who. That sort of personality who's always struggling, who's always sort of, is a good person, but who's always just sort of falling down on the job constantly. And the job is usually kind of trying to forge intimacy with other people, or, really just trying to do almost anything. They're always failing. And so that's an archetype for me that I'm sort of generally attracted to. And, those characters aren't that hard to write in a way for me, which is why I kind of, in some ways, I'm always trying to look for a new version, a new version of that. It would be very hard for me to write someone who's like spectacularily good.
But why not? I feel like that I'm giving you that assignment right now.
I'm just not interested in those people.
Well, here's a
Maybe
question
I just
then.
hate them. I don't know.
Then okay, so I think about this a lot actually. I think about it as a writer, and then I guess I think about it as a teacher too, right? Like how you put yourself on a sort of. And maybe this gets back also to that obsession and repeating oneself in some way. But like, how do you do sort of like a post-op kind of diagnosis of your work where you're like, okay, this is what I do. I did this again, and I did it better maybe, and now I'm going to try this other thing. Like, or I'm sick of doing this and I'm going to do this. Like, do you ever kind of like, when you get a new project?
It doesn't work.
Really?
Like I said, I sort of end up back in the same territory. After my last book, Woke Up Lonely, I was really exhausted. I was just totally burnt out. So the new book, I thought I'm going to try something a little easier, this time.
And what burnt out, like in what regard? Like,
well, I mean that book. I mean, you probably remember. It's my wonderful editor over here. But it went through multiple drafts. I really struggled with its structure. Trying to I just was juggling a lot. There was a lot of characters. It was hard. It was really hard, and I was really intensely, very much involved in. Thematically, what I was trying to do. It was just a kind of a big project. And I mean, I don't know if I was even ready to take it on. So I thought, okay, this time I'm going to do something easier. And I thought, okay, but then it turned out really not to be so easy.
Right.
I mean, I ventured into this new terrain. I mean, so I don't know if some of you have probably read the book, but most of you probably haven't. And it's kind of like a thriller. But you know what? I don't know how to write a thriller. It is not so easy, to write a conspiracy. It's not, especially if you aren't like a pro at it. It's actually very difficult. Plotting is extremely hard. So, it ended up being very challenging for me in completely different ways.
Yeah.
But so I had this ambition that, I was going to do something easy. And so this new book I'm writing, I'm like 80 pages into something.
Right.
And, I have been for like 3 years, so nobody feel disgusted with, it sounds like I'm prolific, but not so much. But, and I was like, okay, I'm going to write something quieter. I'm going to write something that's sort of less antic, and I can feel very strongly the pull, constantly being pulled into that direction. It's supposed to be this.
And you don't want to be antic. Why?
Because I've done it.
Right.
I mean, all three of those novels, in some ways, have inadvertently, been charged up with a lot of energy, and they're mobilizing, what strikes me as this kind of, I don't know, like almost homogenized pathos that seems to just sit atop all of. My characters sort of mobilizes all of that in a very kind of high energy and antic way. There's always a lot happening.
Yeah.
There's stuff that apparently is straining credulity, although, honestly, I never see it. But other people always tell me it's so absurd. I'm like, that's absurd? Normal. But I just thought, okay, let's just like quiet down. Let's return to one character. I'm trying to write a novel that's narrated by one person. Only it follows this one person. It's extremely difficult, to stick with one person over, for the course of especially now when our attention spans are so diffused among, 7,000 different things. So how do I focus on that and that? But I already feel the pull is so strong. Already he's like defrauding the government in some ridiculous Social Security fraud. That's not what I intended. At all. And now I don't know how to get out of it, and I'm only 90 pages in, and I'm loath to start over. But
it was a dream. It was a dream. Exactly. It was a dream that he defrauded the government, and
so the pull is very strong. I mean, I think you have a sensibility, right? And I don't think it's wise to try to escape or repress your sensibility. You are who you are, but that doesn't mean that sensibility can't take a new shape. Can't wear new clothes.
Yeah.
So wish me luck.
I do and
like
I don't. I mean, I like the clothes that your sensibility wears right now.
Also, especially just sidebar, if this novel does really well, which would be completely amazing, then I'm really screwed, because then it's like, well, how do you go off and write something that's completely different after that?
Right, like a really low energy success story, right?
Yeah, it's not gonna happen.
But that would be kind of, seriously, I just feel like I want to give you, I'm going to tell you what to write next.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so this hasn't really exactly come up, but like the mind reading part, like you talked a bit about the guy who had his brain split. The main a main character, /the main character, can read minds.
Spoiler alert.
Am I not supposed to say that?
I'm totally
I wasn't
kidding.
really sure what I'm supposed to say because
totally
it is
kidding.
A bit of a
I'm
mystery.
really kidding.
I think you are allowed
that's fine.
to know
It's
that.
on like the flap copy.
Okay, all right. Have you ever read anybody's mind? And if not, do you have special powers at all?
I'm hesitating, actually. No.
Really, no?
No, I just wanted to build some suspense. No, I feel like people are always surprising me. I always feel like I'm a very good read of people, and then it turns out I'm usually just wrong. And it's not so much like Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is the right explanation. Sometimes that's true, but more often I think I just have no idea what anyone else is thinking around me. And that's a kind of a source of comfort, in a way. So no.
Do you have special powers, though? Anything?
I'm a single mom.
Yeah, that's a pretty, yeah.
I'm going to call that my special power. The thing about the mind reading, though, is I'm going to own up to how it took me a very long time. First of all, I couldn't even decide for a very long time if he could or could not read minds. I mean, I had a draft of this book in which it was all a ruse, and he couldn't read minds at all because I was very uncomfortable. You know, I don't write. I'd never written sci-fi before. It was it seemed hokey to me at first.
Yeah.
I was very uncomfortable with it, and it took me a long time to just have to embrace, like, this is where this novel is.
Yes.
This is what you wrote it.
Right.
You did it. You know, so what I'm always telling my students, you know, you write stuff, you write your fiction makes certain promises, and you either have to make good on those promises, and if you don't like the promises that they're making, go back and rewrite it. But you can't just make a promise and then be like, but leave the promise there. You know, that is not going to fly. So, you know, I had made this promise. It was there. And it took me a really long time to embrace and go, okay, I officially have I'd written in a sci-fi component into this novel. It's there, and so then I had to sort of, got comfortable with it, and then I went back and really kind of whole hog embraced it. And the thing is, of course, he's like a really bad mind reader, which is not so much a source of comedy as it is. I mean, it's not. I mean, I hope it's not like yuck, he's a bad mind reader, which would be so lame. I'm hoping that, you know, there's something more provocative that arises out of that strange phenomenon of being a mind reader who's really bad at it.
Well, but also then it brings in the, you know, again, like questions of like knowledge, self-knowledge, interpretation, you know what I mean?
Have you read, like, you asked me that as if like...
Oh, I don't know. I guess I always sort of think like you are a very, like I really enjoy your mind because you are so smart and so skeptical, but I also feel like the flip side of smart and skeptical is like the ability possibly to embrace the last thing that you would ever embrace. You know what I'm saying?
Fair enough.
And so,
I don't feel skeptical though. I feel I don't feel optimistic about like the world or anything new. But I mean, I feel optimistic about people.
No, but I'm more skeptical about like the ability to read minds or something like that, you know?
Yes.
And anyways, I only ask because I feel like sometimes one's skepticism is put aside. I consider myself also to be a somewhat skeptical person.
Yes, but you've had your experiences. I know this.
Yes, but that's what I'm saying, right? So, but then yeah, that's all I'm saying.
I mean,
like sometimes there has to be that moment where you just sort of see like, I don't know, whatever. The world just sort of cracks open for a second. You're like, maybe, boom, no, not maybe, but maybe.
Look, I mean, I remember I wrote this line in the book at some point. It was about monsters, you know, and how people always say like monsters don't exist. But and I believe this too. What it says in the book is, to me, actually, all that means is that no one has ever seen one yet. You know, I don't discount the possibility of, you know, the supernatural. I probably don't think there's, but I'm also an agnostic, but I'm not an atheist. You know, I think there are things out there that are beyond my reckoning and my knowing, and that's often, you know, why I write, because, you know, you're constantly striving to kind of figure out more, learn more. Well, you know, if you're learning more about how people operate, to me, that is the essence of the unknowable, you know, and so you're constantly striving to get at that. You know, what's the same thing to me as, you know, looking for monsters and mind reading and God, and it's all the unknowable, so let's go after it. I'm just not that interested in some of those other things.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about sentences and momentum. I mean, it's always been true of your work, but maybe this book more than even the others, that there's always been this, as you put it, antic, which I feel you're using in a slightly pejorative, or whatever.
I shouldn't do
You're
that.
being slightly pejorative using that word, and I feel that I want to strip that word of any pejorative connotation. How about energetic, but that also sounds really spazzy. I don't know, whatever. Whatever the perfect word is to describe that has no negative connotation. But that there always was that energy. In this book, I really feel that energy like throws you forward through the pages. And yet at the same time, all the sentences are really, really in and of themselves, these kind of little mini, well, you know, just reading right now as you did. Like most people can't just like go through their books and read sentences and have sentences be so, like mini novels, as you said, right? So I wonder if you thought about that much at all, or, I mean, you know, Sam Lipsyte writes a lot in this way too. I think of him as somebody who writes these really, really like chunky, sound, intense sentences. And you were one of the writers mentioned in The Sentence is a Lonely Place, that essay that was by Gary Lutz in The Believer. And rightly so. Anyways, I just wonder, especially because you admitted, I think is the word, you're teaching a class on page turners. So just like how you think about different kinds of energy, like energy in a sentence and energy like shooting through and forward through a book.
Yeah, well, I mean, in one of the great lines, you all should read this essay. It's amazing. It's called "The Sentence is a Lonely Place."
It is a really great
essay.
And Fiona is mentioned, and Sam Lipsyte is mentioned, and Christine Scott is mentioned. And
I teach that essay a lot, except I always redact myself from the essay.
Yeah, that's a little hard, right?
No, I redacted myself out of there. I mean, you can't teach.
Or do you highlight? You're like, oh, I thought I was redacting.
No, I think, I mean, he's the great line. I mean, there are a lot of great lines in this essay, but the great line is, the sentence is the one true theater of endeavor. I mean, I love that. I'd like to have that, on my tombstone. I mean, so for me, the action of novel writing, the most pleasure I get is in the sentence making. Boy, do I love writing a good sentence, and I will just sit there, and really dwell. But part of what, Gary talks about in that essay is that, you can really get kind of lost in a sentence. And for me, I mean, I think sentence making is one of, it's what I love to do most, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think for me that's the book's strongest point is the sentence making. I really felt like, okay, this is maybe some of the best prose writing I've done is in this book. But sentence making, for all that propulsive energy, I think can also be a little bit of a liability if you cannot tame it.
Yeah.
And that is very hard for me to kind of tame it. And this book, it's like go, go, go.
Or maybe tame, I guess is the word, or channel, or you know what I mean, like have it.
Yeah, to modulate, which is very difficult. I mean, in this book, it works out really well because it is like a bit of a thriller. There is kind of a conspiracy thing happening. Like you're supposed to be boop, doop, 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 as you go along, but it's very hard, when you're trying to write a quieter moment, or you're doing a zoom out, or just for a different kind of novel.
Yeah.
And that's hard for me to kind of shut, because I do have a lot of energy, and it doesn't really get expressed. I think maybe I just need to go to the gym more or something.
Maybe.
But this is my outlet. So this is where all that energy goes, just right onto the page. There's a lot of stuff happening up there, and so yeah. I mean, like anything else, I mean, humor too works the same way.
Yeah.
It can be a real strength or it can be a real liability, and you have to learn how to rein it in, how to calibrate it appropriately and according to what it is you're trying to accomplish on the page. So, like I said, in this novel, I didn't have to do actually that much modulating. Now and then there are some tender moments, but for the most part, it's really go, go, go. Yeah. Which was fun.
Did you, I know, as I already mentioned, you are teaching a class on page turners. Did you study page turners? Like I'm curious, do you train?
No.
I mean, you don't go to the gym, you've already admitted that. But like, is there any kind of like training that you do as a writer? Maybe even project specific? Like for this one?
I do a lot of research. Is what I do. Like I read a lot of thrillers when I was writing this book.
You did,
I was like, how do you write a thriller? I don't know.
And so did you like what?
Well, what was interesting to me about the thrillers is that, well, most of them were just really bad. I mean,
like not thrilling or just badly written?
Very poorly written. I mean, wow.
But still thrilling? Because sometimes still thrilling.
Sometimes, yes. I mean, even the really poorly written ones, I'd still be like just staying up late, disgusted with myself. Because I was like, I need to know what happens.
Exactly.
Some of them, they showed their hands too soon. That's one of the things I was looking at. It's like, when do you show your hand?
Okay.
When do you tip your hat? That was a lot of metaphors here. But like, when do you begin to clue people in? You don't want to keep them in the dark forever because then people just get frustrated. You want to kind of work that discrepancy between like what your main character knows and what your reader knows. But if the reader knows too much ahead of time, they just think the main character's an idiot, which is, it's kind of like when you see this horror movies and you see like the woman in her nightgown and she's like walking towards the mass murder and you're like, oh, it's so scary, but you also think she's an idiot. I don't want to be having that happen. So I was trying to figure out like when, how do you season your work with clues about what's happening? How do you pace everything in terms of like that rate of revelation? So I was trying to look for clues to that. And of course, the plotting, though, in most of these crime novels is quite exceptional.
Yes.
And I don't, so I was trying to learn from that. I mean, I remember Barry Hano's, one of my favorite writers, always saying, well, if I could just plot like, John Grisham, I would just be a genius.
Yeah.
So I was looking for clues and, strategies for how to put a novel like this together. But then I also just did a lot of research. For a while, I thought the book was going to be really a lot about Watergate. You'd never know it from reading the final. I know. Editors are like, what are you talking about? But one of the characters used to be a kind of rather well-known neurologist, and he was very much interested in fMRI, which is a kind of brain scanning technology that is being used in a very scary way to actually read people's minds. But he used to be a polygrapher back in, 1970s, and I had this idea that he was the guy who gave the polygraph test to Magruder, who I don't know how many of you know your Watergate, but Magruder was really in there. So then I started obsessing over whether this was possible, and I tracked down John Dean, who was White House counsel, and I tracked him down through Stanley Cutler, who had written this big biography. This was just nuts what I was doing. And I managed to get John Dean on record saying, like, well, okay, this is how the polygraph was administered to Jeb Magruder, and I was like, I've got my novel.
Right.
Like,
and did you actually,
none of that.
Did you write that though? Like, was that written?
A little bit, and I was listening. I was in Denmark at the time, and I was quite ill, and I couldn't write at all, but I couldn't sleep, and so I was listening with my big headphones to a lot of the Nixon tapes, and I was just getting this is some crazy stuff to listen to at night in Denmark, with your big poofy headphones, and you can't hear anything. It's very quiet in the middle of the country. I'm listening to Nixon, talk about the Klieg lights, and it's a horrible profanity, and I did that for almost like 10 days in Denmark. I didn't write a word. So I really thought that this was, I used none of it. But that's some research I did.
Yeah.
Massive sidebar, folks.
But you actually never wrote that. Like, it was never
It was going nowhere.
It was
going nowhere. I mean, I was really interested in the fMRI being a kind of logical next, like a successor to the polygraph machine. And so there's two lines in the book, I think, about Nixon talking about how the polygraph machine was scaring everyone to death. That's what it all got boiled down to. It's two lousy lines. But Stanley Cutler still got acknowledged in the in the acknowledgments because he played a big role in the book I never wrote.
Yeah.
But also I think I had heard that like A.M. Holmes was writing about Watergate, and I was like, okay, I'm out of there.
Wow.
Like, no, I can't. I'm not going to even go there.
So I mean, are you pretty good then about, because it sounds like, okay, not to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like if you're going to waste time as a writer, you do it doing research. Was that correct? Would you say?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I really like the research. Research is a great way. You can really hide behind research.
Yeah.
Like, well, I'm researching.
Right.
So and then you don't have to write. So.
But then I'm interested that you know that you have some sort of internal editing process where actually before you sit down to write something like, oh, all that research.
Sometimes.
Okay.
I mean, the Watergate stuff, it was clear. That's just going nowhere. I mean, I just wasn't getting a handle on it. It was too big. There was so much, there's so many doors opening, and I just thought, have some discipline. This is one thing that I think is a kind of a good criticism that has been levied against my work over the years, especially my first book, which was, I remember the review, it was, oh, for God's sakes. Okay, now I'm blanking on his name. It was a Brooklyn College, guy who runs Brooklyn College program. Okay, never mind.
Josh.
Yes, Josh Hanken. So Josh wrote this review of my
first
book.
I read your mind.
Yeah, you did.
I totally did.
And one thing he had said was that at some point in the novel, it kind of felt like, I don't know, things felt sort of arbitrary to him, that, you could just as soon be in St. Louis as you could be in Texas, as you could be on the moon. And I was like a little wounded, but I also thought, that's kind of right, that I had not imposed sufficient discipline on my choices. And so, do we really need to hear about everything and everybody? Yes, but the rest of the world says no. And I think it's sometimes wise to pay attention to what the rest of the world is telling you. So I was trying to be a little disciplined and not let, everything that I wanted to be writing about sort of crowd in there.
Get in there.
It was less of a prog rock novel.
Yeah,
than,
I getcha.
I had started.
I
so no,
getcha.
I don't always know, but sometimes, yeah, absolutely. I'll go barking right up a very wrong tree and kind of hang out there for a really long time.
So are there like a lot, did you cut a lot from this book? I mean, I'm curious just in terms of, since the last book was so, the editing of it was somewhat traumatic. Did you learn something and not?
I did.
You did?
I did not cut nearly as much from this book. I have my last book, there's an ejecta file because, of course, I can't actually delete anything I've written because it's too valuable. So I just throw it in this ejecta file, which was hundreds and hundreds of pages long. I mean, it was horrible. This one, maybe 30 pages, like really. But
what?
I also
That's
was plotting.
Crazy.
I was plotting this book out, like I would write, because it has this ABC A structure. I always saw one chapter ahead, and I would plot. Okay, this is what happens to A, B, C, D. Oh my God, we're getting yanked.
No, we're not. No, we are doing, it was just meaningless semaphores. Keep going. Yeah.
Anyway, so this just to say that, by plotting always one step ahead, I managed to keep fairly disciplined, and I just had my little notebook, and I wrote like ABCD or ABCA. Phil goes here, Ada does this, Doc does this, Phil does this, and I'd have the next 4 sections.
And would you just
done.
go like one section ahead? You didn't do the whole book?
No, I had no idea. Until about halfway through, and then at that point I was like, if I don't figure out this conspiracy, this book's gonna suck. So I did what I always do, which is to consult my mom at a certain point in crisis. And I tell my mom the plot of my book, and then we argue a lot about it, and like she'll give me ideas and I'll be like, no, and then I'll give her my ideas and she'll be like, no, that has no dramatic effect whatsoever. And then we kind of like hash this out back and forth in the kitchen, and there's like a lot of fighting.
So that's great. So your
there
mom.
she is back there.
So she doesn't read it. You just
I just
tell
her, and I say,
I
look,
love that.
This is what's happening.
Right.
I was like, I have no idea what happens next, and I'm gonna know. I have to figure this out. I can't keep writing without knowing like who's the bad guy.
Right.
What the story is. So, and we go back and forth, and I always find this actually horribly annoying, like really irritating, and then in the end, somehow it produces something, and then I go back to work.
I will say that narrating ones, I've just started to do this because I have kids, as you have as well, and they are very useful for this kind of thing. Also mothers, it turns out, right? That you just will be like, so here's the deal. And I was started to like narrate a plot to one of my kids, and they just stopped me right away, and they were like, but why would she do that?
Yeah.
Right? Like just right away, they're like, but why? And you're like,
yeah.
oh.
And don't you then want to kill them?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very complicated emotional, exchange.
But it's very, I have to say, like, yeah, I think it was like 6 was the age where they had that, I don't know, they were very useful editors, maybe 6, and then like, Yeah.
Great, I have something to look forward to.
Yeah, exactly.
My kid can be like,
Okay, the semaphore said I'm supposed to open this up to you people. Should your mother get the first question? I don't know. Do you have a question that you feel only in the safety of this room you can ask? Yeah.
I mean, we could talk about, anything. It's okay if you haven't read the novel. I mean,
yeah.
Do I always have the same editor for book to book to book? I've had actually 3 editors, and they've all been amazing. Actually, one of them is right there. Although Fiona helped also with this last book at Graywolf, but I had kind of a principal who I worked very closely with, Steve Woodward. He was great. And at FSG, who published my first book, my editor's no longer there. His name was Paul Eli, and it was wonderful. It was my first experience there. I've been incredibly lucky. I mean, most people haven't had the luck that I've had. But he and I would meet once a week and go through 20 pages every single week for 6 months. I know,
Whoa.
right? Like who, And then Fiona and I, I'm just gonna point at you. Also, my editor's named Fiona, which is there's kinship, right? We're like this. But and Woke Up Lonely, we worked very closely together. And I remember going into that meeting, the first meeting, just terrorized. I was really frightened by how this was going to go. But I thought didn't it go well? I thought it went great. We worked very closely and collaboratively, section by section. And I had the same experience with Steve too. Also at Graywolf, I was a little terrorized, and then we went in, and it's amazing how like my ego never diminishes. Also, my amazing agent is here too, but it's interesting. Like each time, I remember I sent Stacia, who's my agent, my novel, and she had all these comments, and I'm like, I'm just gonna tell. I was like, who are you? Like, why are you saying? What is this? And then I went through the comments, and I'm like, oh my god, wow, it's great, and great line editing. But each time, I always think somehow that like the book's done, and then it turns out the book's not done like at all. And actually, there are incredibly brilliant people out there who have a lot to say. And all 3 of my books they're just so much better, than they were when I handed them in. And I was pretty sure I was done. So when you have like a great editor who really kind of gets what you're doing and is ready to play ball with you, then it's really an exciting, thrilling experience because you get pushed. I remember Fiona, after my first book, after we left, I think I probably called my mom again, and I was like, I can't do any of the things she wants me to do. She's pushing me very hard, and I was like, I'm not good enough to do any of the things. Why don't you raise the tension on this? Why don't you explore more of this? I'm like, what? But you have to double down, and really, try to rise up to the challenge. So I tried in any case.
Yeah.
I was wondering, were the poetics a helpful way to strategize in how you set up the book?
Explain. What do you mean?
The poetics written by Aristotle.
Oh, the actual poetics.
Yeah.
No, it's like, no.
So how would
not at
you
all.
plot your storyline as to make sure like you know where the story was going to go? I know you started halfway through to decide where it was going to end.
Well, I mean, there was a lot of kind of groping in the dark, really. You know, I mean, this is my theory about writing in general. There are a lot of writers who are very good at plotting, you know, I don't know if you're like this, but, you know, no way. And they really know where everything's going. They've storyboarded everything out. There's nothing wrong with that, you know. A lot of people say that that kind of forecloses on spontaneity. I don't think so. I think that just allows you to have, there's nothing that says you have to stick to that, but it gives you a framework. I'm not able to do that. I have no idea, you know, where I'm going. But I have a sense of drama and a sense of, you know, what needs to happen next, basically. You know, okay, we need to sort of raise the tension here, or the stakes have to rise here, or we have to explore this sort of, now is the time to explore this backstory. And I proceed a lot on instinct, and I want to have a good answer for you. But a lot of it is just sort of instinct and trial and error. You know, I mean, you think about just, if you're in the dark and you're groping around, like you're going to grab something and it's going to be like squishy and repulsive and you're going to drop it immediately and be like, whoa, that is not right. And sometimes you'll grab something and it'll feel like a good, like a nice solid vine, you know, that you can hold on to, that will take you someplace new, and halfway while you're swinging, you're like, oh man, this vine sucks. And that's it, you got to let it go. And maybe your third try, like you actually grab onto something that really is a vine and will take you, you know, someplace new. So there's a lot of trial and error. The only thing I knew for sure was that I was doing A, B, C, A. And no matter what, I was not going to depart from that structure. It didn't feel so much like a formal conceit as it just felt like a kind of lifeline, you know, to just keep me tethered to something, you know, especially as the plot got more and more involved and things started to get like a little bit crazier, and really trying to like impose some control, you know, on this. I mean, you know, if I'm not careful, like suddenly there's just going to be like a unicorn just like walking through, you know, the fiction, just waltzing right through. So, I mean, I want to have
I was wondering on that practice in the case where you feel like your creativity comes from writing the story.
Where does my creativity come from?
Because you're talking about instinct and you're grabbing something that feels right but it doesn't feel right. So trusting that intuition, where would you say creativity to start that intuition comes from?
I mean, I wish I knew.
Sorry, I don't mean to stump you.
No, I mean, you know, people, the other form of that question is like, you know, who influences you, or who do you read, or, you know, today somebody asked me like what, you know, art influences you, and I never know how to answer those questions. You know, the logic of influence has always stumped me. I mean, I feel like if you are alive...
Even self-influence.
Yeah, I mean, if you know, I mean, what is writing if not trying to imprint your sensibility on the page? So what constructs a sensibility? You know, it's everything. You know, who your parents were, and you know, who your friends are, and you know, my subway ride up here. You know, last night I was on a plane and I was trapped by two people that smelled incredibly bad. Like, what are the odds of that on either side of you? They both smell freakishly bad. Surely that is helping to construe, you know, something, you know, in me that might come out later. You know, I don't know how to answer that question, but I really do think that, you know, writing is really just about taking your sensibility. I mean, you were refracting everything that you're interested in through, you know, your consciousness. So to me, it's like that question is like, well, you know, how did you become who you are? And you know, I don't know. Mom? No. I don't know. I do think that maybe one good way of answering that, though, is that whoever you are, whatever you are, you just try to make sure that you are available and vulnerable to the world around you. Like, I have a no headphones policy on the subway, even though I'm dying to listen to my, you know, something, but like, I cannot shut out. I have to pay attention, you know, to the world around me so that I can stay vulnerable and stay available. That's something. Ooh, people. Hello.
I find that on the rare occasion when something that I write manages to be funny, my instinct for whether
I can tell you are way funnier than you think.
well, I wanted to know, like, did you find it the way I find it? It's you know, just like a little bit of time goes by. Like, I'm someone who will sometimes laugh at the same joke many times, but I find editing humor really difficult because I get bogged down in, is this only funny to me, or was this only funny once? Like, is this funny enough to be in the book? Is there
That's a good question. I mean, one thing I'll just say about humor is that I think if things are funny, if they're deeply funny, they're always going to be funny. I mean, humor for me is always about that sort of collision, sort of incongruity between, people's sort of better intentions and, what generally tends to happen. And when you're kind of marrying up, pathos with circumstance, humor is usually what results. So the deeply funny will always stay funny. So for me, the revision isn't so, it's always yuck humor, slapstick that tends to not survive the test of time. I mean, revising is, I never worry that I'm making things worse. I just worry that I don't know how to make them better. My first drafts, they're getting better and better. The more experience you have, the less, likely you are for your first drafts to be absolutely awful, although they might be awful in some ways and not others. But I don't worry too much about humor. I don't think about humor all that much, which sounds maybe odd because apparently some of the books are funny, but I don't think about it. Humor comes sort of easily to me, and you always hear people say like we tend to disparage the things that come to us with the greatest ease, and so I'm the least interested in humor actually as a kind of weapon for artistry so I don't think about humor too much. I think much more about those sort of quiet scenes, the scenes where I'm really trying to get at something dark and difficult and sad. Those are the scenes I really think about, how to work over. But mostly for me, revision is usually about discipline. It's usually about not going on and on. I mean, apparently I'm a maximalist. I just can go. And so it's about pruning. The tree, that's for me the hardest part. Not so much kill your darlings. I mean, whatever, I don't care. I've got an ejective file, nothing ever dies. But it's more about just, creating like a kind of an emotional hierarchy and a shape. I mean, my first drafts will just be like bedhead. That's my first draft. It's not terrible, but it's still bedhead. And you have to shape it, and that's where revision comes into play for me. I don't know, did that answer your question? Kind?
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
Oh.
I was interested about the relationship for you between research and writing. So you mentioned you like doing the research and can be productive without having to be productive on the writing itself. So do you find that you're often already thinking about things or even obsessed with something and it kind of works its way into the novel? Or do you find you at a certain point in the novel you need to learn about something? So in Wolf Lonely, for instance, I learned a lot about cloud seeding in North Korea that I didn't know before. And were those things you were already interested in? Or
No. No, I don't know anything when I go into my books, which is really the fun of it. I know the reason I got interested in cloud seeding, actually I can't remember which came first. I think it was because it might have actually been like some really weird private joke. Like I had read some review that said, well, this book is clearly inspired by Kurt Vonnegut. And like I had never read a word of Kurt Vonnegut before. But I was sort of intrigued by that. And it turns out that like his brother was a very kind of well-renowned cloud seeder. And I thought, well, this will be fun. So let's roll with that. And so the cloud seeder calls his plane the Bernard, which is Vonnegut's brother's name. So a lot of like inside fun there for me. But no, I mean, I'll just be like randomly surfing the internet and I'll be like, cloud seeding, what the hell is that? And then I'll think, oh, well, this actually thematically could make sense. And then I will go off and read just enough to make it look like I know a whole lot more than I do. You have to fool. I mean, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an environmentalist, so I read just enough to make sure that my character looks like he's the expert he purports to be. Because you're only just showing tip of the iceberg stuff, when you're doing your research. I mean, there's some people like Jim Shepard, for instance, who will research exhaustively everything, and he really does know as much as, his characters purport to know about the most obscure, amazing things. Not so much me. I will learn enough to do what has to be done. And if I'm really interested, I'll go back. But I can feel, research for me kind of feels like I don't know, soda in the cup, okay? And you're pouring your soda, and there's a certain moment where it's gonna bubble over, and that's the moment where I stop the research and I go back. I can feel it exactly when I know what I need. And then I go off and I go and write, what needs to get written. But no, it's not like I have all these kind of arcane, Renaissance interests and then decide, oh, well, I know all this amazing stuff. Let's put it in a novel. But it's a great excuse to constantly, go off and learn new things. I love that. I mean, that's one of the joys for me. It's like, well, what can I learn today? And I can use the excuse of, learning this new thing because I'm going to write about it. So, this is how this is how I keep things sort of fresh for me. It's also a little bit to do with, this whole notion of like write what you know. I'm not so into that, but I'm more about like finding sort of backdoor approaches to kind of backdoor entryways to writing what maybe what you're obsessed with, which, like I said, is loneliness. So here we come full circle, right back to where we started. I wish I could chat with all of you guys more, but apparently we are out of time.